The sun rose softly over the still lake, its golden light scattering across the water like shattered glass. My neighbors stood in silent disbelief, clutching their morning coffees as they stared at the sight before them. A solid 6-foot wooden fence now sliced straight through the middle of what had once been a shared lakefront paradise. It split lawns, cut off water access, and even severed the community dock in half like a bad magic trick. On one side of the fence, Patricia's cousin, Cynthia, stood frozen with her mouth open. She stared at her trapped, set-up luxury lounge chairs and a gleaming jet ski ramp, all now caged in by wooden panels. On my side, I calmly tightened the last bolt, wiped the sweat from my brow, and gave the stunned crowd a polite little wave. But to really understand how we got here, I have to rewind a few years. 5 years ago, I bought my dream home in Maplewood Creek community. I was drawn in by one irresistible promise: deeded lakefront access. That property came with legal rights to the shared waterfront. It included a wide sandy beach and a community dock that my kids adored. Every summer weekend was pure magic. We spent hours swimming, fishing, grilling, and watching sunsets melt into the water. It was everything I had worked for, and every cent of the lakefront premium felt worth it. But everything changed 6 months ago when Patricia Lawson became our new HOA president. If you've ever wondered what happens when someone with a Napoleon complex gets even the tiniest whiff of authority, well, Patricia was the case study. Within weeks, she was completely out of control. She slapped homeowners with new fines for grass growing half an inch too tall. She declared wind chimes a noise hazard and banned them entirely. She even required written permission to plant any unapproved flowers. But Patricia's true talent was nepotism. Her brother-in-law suddenly had a paid position as our landscape inspector. Her best friend snagged the lucrative contract for the neighborhood pool maintenance. When her cousin Cynthia flew in from out of state, Patricia decided the HOA bylaws were merely polite suggestions. The first sign of trouble came on a quiet Tuesday morning when I stepped outside. I found Cynthia staking her claim on the shared lakefront, and I don't mean with a simple towel and chair. She was setting up what looked like an exclusive private resort right on our sand. She had top-tier lounge chairs, a full speaker system, tiki torches, and workers installing a private jet ski ramp. It completely blocked my family's access to the water and ruined our cherished view. I walked over, polite and calm, and introduced myself. Cynthia looked me up and down like I had interrupted royalty. In a clipped, dismissive tone, she informed me of Patricia's new rules. She claimed Patricia had reassigned that portion of the lakefront for her exclusive use during her extended visit. Apparently, she thought my family was wasting the space by only using it on weekends. Cynthia, on the other hand, insisted she needed it for her book club gatherings. When I pointed out that the waterfront was shared, deeded property, she waved a piece of paper right in my face. Smugly, she told me to take it up with the HOA if I had a problem. It was an easement reassignment, dated just 3 days earlier. It claimed the board granted Cynthia temporary exclusive use. The document stated this would maximize community resources. To make it even more insulting, the vote was supposedly unanimous, despite 2 board members being out of town that entire week. That was my first clue that something smelled fishier than the lake after a summer storm. I immediately contacted the city planning office and the county property records department to check the facts. Both confirmed what I already suspected. The lakefront rights were deeded to individual properties, not controlled by the HOA. Changing that required legal documentation and signed consent from everyone. Patricia's little reassignment was legally worth about as much as a doodle on a napkin. When I brought all this up at the next HOA meeting, Patricia's face turned a shade of purple I didn't know existed. She gripped the podium with white knuckles and practically screeched that the HOA had recently amended its bylaws to include waterfront management. She threatened $500 daily fines for interfering. Then, as if on cue, she whipped out another piece of suspicious paperwork. She claimed this bylaw change had been approved during a special meeting the previous month, though no one else remembered it. Meanwhile, Cynthia had turned our tranquil lakefront into a non-stop party hub. Her speakers blasted music from dawn till night. Her guests trashed the sand with beer cans and fast food wrappers. The jet ski ramp was a giant eyesore and broke at least 3 environmental regulations. The final straw came one morning when my 8-year-old daughter went down for her usual morning swim. Cynthia physically blocked her path and told her it was now private property. My little girl came home with tears streaming down her face. That was it for me. It was time to fight back. I spent the next week doing what I do best as a contracts lawyer, digging through every line of documentation. I pulled my original purchase agreement, the property survey, and the HOA charter. The truth was beautifully simple. The lakefront access was permanently and irrevocably deeded to specific lots, including mine. The HOA charter clearly stated the board had zero authority over deeded rights. Any attempt to tamper with those rights would make the board members personally liable for damages. I drafted a formal legal notice to both the HOA and Cynthia, giving them a strict 72-hour deadline. They had to remove all personal items and restore community access, or I would take them to court. I sent it via certified mail and email, then waited. Their reaction was entirely predictable. The next morning, Patricia showed up at my front door with Cynthia at her side. They brought a man in a wrinkled suit who claimed to be a lawyer, but looked like he learned law from daytime TV shows. They came at me from every angle with threats, bribes, and desperate attempts to sway me. Patricia tried the reasonable approach first, flashing a strained, fake smile to ease the tension. She promised to waive my HOA dues for an entire year if I would just drop the issue. Cynthia chimed in with her own ridiculous offer, saying my family could use the lakefront every other Wednesday. She acted as if access to my own deeded property were some kind of timeshare. And then there was the lawyer, mumbling about adverse possession and squatters' rights like he was on a legal drama. I actually laughed out loud. I calmly declined all their offers and showed them my own legal credentials, their faces twisted from fake charm to absolute fury. Patricia hissed a final warning. She told me I would regret ever crossing her before they all stomped off in a storm of indignation. The 72-hour deadline came and went without a single piece of furniture being removed from the sand. In fact, Cynthia had doubled down, dragging out more patio sets and even starting construction on what looked like a permanent shade structure. Fine, if they wanted to play hardball, I was ready. I initiated Phase 2. I hired a licensed surveyor to mark the exact property lines of the lakefront. When the results came in, they were crystal clear. The waterfront access was deeded down the middle. Each homeowner had rights to their specific section. Cynthia's elaborate setup sprawled well beyond hers, trampling entirely over mine. Armed with the official survey, I drove to the building supply store. The teenage clerk's eyes went wide when I told him how much fencing I planned to buy and exactly where it was going. In a small community like ours, word travels faster than the wind on the lake. By the time I got home, my phone was buzzing nonstop. Curious neighbors were all asking the same question. Was I really putting up a fence right down the middle of the beautiful lakefront? I gave them the simplest answer possible. I told them I was just marking my property line. The next morning, just after dawn, I showed up at the lakefront with a professional fence installation crew. We had everything we needed: permits, survey stakes, and enough fence panels to make Robert Frost smile. The line was perfect, straight as an arrow, slicing across the sand and down the shared dock. It went all the way to the waterline, clean, legal, and final. At 7 a.m., Cynthia stumbled out of her house with a mug of coffee, arriving just in time to see the tall wooden panels going up. The mug slipped from her hands and shattered against the deck. She let out a scream loud enough to rattle the ducks on the far shore. Within minutes, Patricia arrived, still in her bathrobe and curlers. Behind her came half the neighborhood, clearly ready for the morning entertainment. The meltdown was nothing short of spectacular. Patricia hurled every wild accusation she could possibly think of. She screamed about vandalism, trespassing, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and even identity theft for some reason. She called the police. They showed up, checked my permits, and shrugged. The officers left without doing a thing. Then she called the city inspector. He arrived and quickly confirmed the fence was perfectly within code. She called the mayor and even her congressman. I swear, I think she even tried calling the president. Each call ended the exact same way, with her voice getting higher and more desperate. Cynthia wasn't doing any better on her side of the line. Her precious jet ski ramp now sat half inaccessible behind the wooden fence. Her speaker system was cleanly bisected, with one speaker mocking her from my side of the property line. The half-built shade structure straddled both sections, rendering it completely useless. Her construction crew quietly packed up their tools and drove off as she stood there in total shock. She was opening and closing her mouth like a stranded goldfish. That evening, the emergency HOA meeting drew a packed house. Patricia had gone on the offensive, printing angry flyers about me. She called me a neighborhood terrorist who was destroying property values and community harmony. She stood at the podium, voice trembling with rage, demanding the board fine me into bankruptcy. But that's when the tide finally shifted. William Montgomery, a retired judge who lived 3 doors down, stood up first. Calmly and clearly, he addressed the entire crowded room of homeowners. He explained that the board's recent actions had exposed them all to severe personal liability. Next, Jessica Miller, whose flower garden had been bulldozed by Patricia, presented her own legal findings. Then more neighbors followed, one after another, airing their grievances. By the time 6 homeowners had spoken, it was clear the Patricia era was crumbling. The calls for her resignation started as murmurs. They quickly grew into a loud chant. The final blow came when Cynthia's husband flew in from out of state. He surveyed the mess, the fence, the trashed setup, and Cynthia sobbing in her oversized sun hat. He made a swift executive decision. They were leaving immediately. As movers carried their furniture away, neighbors overheard him telling Cynthia that her cousin's power trip had caused a disaster. Back at the meeting, Patricia made one last desperate play. She stood at the podium and dramatically announced that, as HOA president, she was issuing an executive order to have the fence removed. That's when the board's attorney, who had been silently scribbling notes all evening, finally stood up. His words cut like clean steel. He declared that Patricia had no such legal authority. Her actions had already exposed the HOA to multiple legal vulnerabilities, and the board needed to act immediately to contain the fallout. The vote that followed was remarkably swift and unanimous. Patricia was removed as HOA president on the spot. But that wasn't the end of her nightmare. The board also voted to pursue legal action against her for the blatant misuse of HOA funds. It turned out she had used the association's legal budget to pay for Cynthia's bogus easement paperwork. Further accounting revealed she had been skimming from the landscaping budget as well. She was padding her brother-in-law's fake inspection contracts with community money. 3 months later, Patricia stood trembling in front of a judge. Tears streamed down her cheeks in the courtroom. The verdict was read: guilty of embezzlement, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. Her sentence included 2 years of probation, 300 hours of community service, and restitution of $47,000 to the HOA. The judge's closing remarks were scathing. He emphasized that abusing community trust for personal gain was a serious offense, one that came with very real consequences. As the gavel came down, she broke. Patricia sobbed openly into her attorney's arms. Her self-proclaimed reign as the neighborhood tyrant was over, not with a bang, but with the sound of her own downfall echoing through the courtroom.